Hey everybody, video here for you today. We're going to look at my number 6 most mysterious site in Egypt video. We're going to go down to Abydos today, the Osireion, and here is the Oseirion right behind the Temple of Seti, right here. And there is also a temple of Ramses II here, also, not just a temple of Seti. Seems this was a very sacred spot. Let me just back out for 1 second. Here you see a place mark, 7,300-year-old city, going back to 5,300 BC. Why do I have that marker there? But here's a story from 2016. Ancient residential city, cemetery discovered at Abydos. The head of the antiquities sector announced the discovery of a cemetery and residential city dating back to 5,316 BC. So that's over 2,000 years before the official recognized start of dynastic Egypt. Clearly, the history here at Abydos stretches back to unrecognized times. Right down here in this area, we have a very ancient harbor that was used, and there was a temple of Khenti-Amenti right here. Who's Khenti-Amenti? Well, we know him as Anubis, and then Osiris kind of shifted into his place as the most important recognized god of Egypt around 4,000 years ago, or a little bit past that. The very first dynasty kings are buried here. This was a very sacred place at the very start of recognized dynastic Egyptian history. But the last 10 minutes of this video, John Anthony West is going to lead a tour down here at the Osireion. Now, early explorers were down here at Abydos. Petrie was here almost 120 years ago, and these are pics of when the Osireion was excavated. In recent times, here you see what was buried. Here you see the workers here. And this is totally unlike what we see today, but you can see the top of the stone sticking out here, and then you see up above the Temple of Seti and the classic dynastic Egyptian style building here. And then right down here you see these megalithic blocks that look so familiar from very ancient sites, including Peru. But it seems important dynastic Egyptian rulers always knew this was here. A lot of pharaohs seem to have carved their names in different little areas of this place. But this always seemed to be a sacred place, and it was down below the surface. Dynastic Egyptians did not carve into the ground to create a temple. The dynastic Egyptians tell us themselves they're a legacy civilization. There's a king's list right in the Temple of Seti right here. That goes back thousands of years prior to the first dynasty of Egypt. Megalithic blocks that were not used, that style, by the dynastic Egyptians. And it's down below the surface where the dynastic Egyptians were building. This place seems to go way back in time, and Abydos is clearly one of the oldest spots in Egypt. Seems the only problem dynastic Egyptian pharaohs had was keeping the sand out of this place. Now, when I say the dynastic Egyptians did not build temples down in pits, well, the Sphinx and the Sphinx temple are obviously down in pits, but originally constructed not by the dynastic Egyptians. There is Old Kingdom repair blocks in the very ancient weathering here that proves this was already deteriorated a lot when the Old Kingdom came along. And if the Old Kingdom built the Sphinx, they certainly wouldn't be putting restoration blocks in erosion grooves that would have taken thousands of years. Anybody who tells you the Sphinx is only 4,500 years old, well, and right next to the Sphinx temple, here is the Valley Temple, called the Valley Temple by the current standard model of history. Obviously, this is a temple just like the Osireion. This is a temple that honors the rebirth and the afterlife of Osiris. This isn't the Valley Temple of Khafre. Was the pyramid behind the Sphinx built 4,500 years ago? Nothing really carved in it. These pharaohs wanted to be immortalized for all time. Would they have built these and not put their name anywhere on them? Well, I think that's ridiculous. Then in the very next dynasty, they were building these little pyramids down at Saqqara and inscribing the whole pyramid text in them. Is that the way the history went? Was a big pyramid here built in the 4th dynasty? Nothing inscribed in it. Is that the way the history went? They went from this in one dynasty to the very next dynasty building this. Nothing inscribed to the whole pyramid text inscribed in these little pyramids. Is that the way the history went? Well, I don't buy that for 1 second. Now here's another centuries plus old pic of the Osireion when they were here, and this will give you some idea of scale. The people down here, and then these massive granite blocks. I think it's time that we have to assume that this was built by the builder gods. They seem to have prolific knowledge of stonework. And here you see the Temple of Seti up here. The smaller blocks used to create that wall. And down here, what must have they thought when they first uncovered this? Well, this was built by the gods, as I call them. The text says people came here after their island sank in a cataclysm, and they reconstructed the temples of their former world along the banks of the Nile. And this is clearly one of the more sacred spots in Egypt. Now here is the video I made about 1.5 years ago, the Devil's Punch Bowl, pre-Egyptian superstructure or tomb. And this, I believe, was my number 8 or 9 most mysterious site in Egypt. But this lies just west of the Osireion, and I have high doubts if this was built during the 12th dynasty and was a tomb of Senroset. This is a very, very strange place. It just seems that this place might indeed be one of the places built by the builder gods. Could this be a tomb of Osiris down here at Abydos, just like we have a tomb of Osiris beneath the Giza Plateau? Well, I really wonder. Here is a massive granite sarcophagus, a serapeum-like sarcophagus in this place. Was this a tomb of a 12th dynasty pharaoh? Well, I highly doubt it. Now here is another old pic, and this will give you some idea of scale, but man, what they must have thought must have amazed them back then, because pretty much it still boggles our mind today. Who did this? When? And here is what remains today. What was the meaning of this place? Well, I don't think the people have been wrong associating it with Osiris, and that's what we call him today. There was an ancient word for Osiris, an ancient name. I don't think this is the tomb of Osiris. I think this is the temple that celebrates his resurrection or rebirth in the afterlife. But I think this right here is a shaft that goes way down, and that represents Osiris emerging from the underworld in his rebirth in the afterlife. That is just my thoughts. But during the dynastic Egyptian period, the aspects and the versions of the gods just grew and grew. But Osiris and aspects of Osiris were often depicted as a rabbit. You see, it's what they saw. Rabbits emerge from a hole coming up from the underworld. It directly relates to the story of Osiris. The gods, the animals, it's what they saw. Now, I'm not going to talk for very much longer, but just to the west and a little bit to the north of the Osireion, here is the royal necropolis, the royal cemetery. The very earliest rulers that we know about from the standard model of history come from here. I've done some videos on pre-dynastic rulers from here, and there are even labels down here that have been found that are on pre-dynastic rulers, obviously, because we have not been able to identify them. Here's one of the tombs of one of the very early dynastic rulers. They were not building very special. The Osireion comes from a total different period of building, and it came much earlier. But that's why the very earliest dynasty rulers are buried here. This was considered a very sacred place. Why? Because the builder gods built here, and the Osireion is one of the places. So those are a lot of my thoughts on the Osireion. Now I'm going to play a 10-minute clip from this video. This comes from my friend Carlos's channel. It comes from an almost an hour-and-a-half video of John Anthony West at the Osirion and the Temple of Seti here. It gives you a look at the King's List. Great video, and I really appreciate Carlos letting me use these clips. I will leave this full video link below, but if you like John Anthony West, and I've said many times his memory will always be kept alive on my channel, well, here you go. After this, you can watch an hour-and-a-half tour from here. But just ending my video here, here is a 10-minute look from down at the Osireion with John Anthony West. I hope you enjoyed this video, and you all have a very nice day.
It is as empty as this, and there are no grockles here. Nothing can stop us from taking a couple of minutes of silence. And with all of the doves cooing, and it seems to me I heard an owl a little bit before. Let's just take a couple of minutes of silence, which I would like to do often in many of the places, and half the time they just won't let it. Idiots. Anyway, a couple of people have asked me, and I think my friend Charlie has really done this extensive work on this, and what he's done is decipher and explain the meaning of the ruinous but still legible hieroglyphs in that called the cenotaph, which is not the tomb of Merneptah, but it commemorates his reign, and in it is this otherwise mysterious book of Nut. One of the funerary texts, and it's that which Charlie is decoding that's going to be the source of this book, which is it's about the reestablishment of Ma'at, which involves the reconciliation of the otherwise irreconcilable solar, lunar, and zodiacal years. And it's done in a very clever fashion. But the big question, from my point of view, actually, is not so much decoding that, which is important from an Egyptological point of view, but rather it's the age of this particular part of the temple here. And my guess is, and Charlie thinks so too, that Seti is building his temple in a classical sort of way. I mean, it has the 7 sanctuaries and all of that, but it otherwise follows the plan of other New Kingdom temples. And in theory, it should have gone back to here, back further, but not where it ended up. It shouldn't have skewed off to the left as it did, and with the Ramses hallway and the stairs that lead us here. That Seti is cutting in his temple, and he comes across the Osireion, this part of the Osireion, probably ruinous, maybe, that's conjecture, and then he decides to skew his old temple around and maybe reconstruct here. There's a lot of open questions here, but it's next to inconceivable given how the Egyptians built their temples. I mean, they built them in all kinds of different ways, but never ever did they cut one into the ground, a whole temple. On the other hand, playing my own devil's advocate, because it is supposed to be the tomb of the head of Osiris, maybe this is an exception, and they actually did do this, but stylistically, it's next to impossible to conceive of the same person building the temple we've just spent all this time going through, and then doing this unbelievable thing here with these blocks of granite, which weigh, I'm not exactly sure, but my guess would be upwards of 100 tons. Could figure it out. Something of that nature, and I'll bet if you stand what you did in the Valley Temple, if you stood up on the top there and did a look down them, you'll find that they're absolutely precise. There's not there's not 1/100th of an inch tolerance in it. So, but when it was done, and I asked Chuck at some point when we were first doing our research, and it looks like it's in crumbly bedrock, right, where it's cut in over there. And I asked Chuck if that was crumbly bedrock or impacted Nile silt, and he took one look and he said, oh no, it's impacted Nile silt. So, and it's known that in the very, very distant past, there were gigantic floods over a number of years, way higher than anything around today. And if that, you could date the Nile silt because it has all kinds of organic matter in it. So, of course, if you dated it and you got an astronomically old time, it doesn't necessarily mean that the temple is coeval with, in other words, that the temple is there before it's covered with silt. Could mean that they just cut into the silt and put the temple up, but it would be a piece of interesting, enough circumstantial evidence so that, that you'd be inclined to pursue the matter further. I don't know. Anyway, it's in that Merneptah there, and then Seti more on that Book of Nut, on the hieroglyphs over underneath there. And it's too bad we can't get in because with it nice and dry like this, it'd be nice to sit down and do a 10-15 minute meditation, but they won't let us. So anyway, at least we're here and not shivering in 10 below zero cold in New York. I was there. Well, they had lots of. They were growing. They was all covered with plants growing in there, and lots of catfish swimming around because the guards brought in some catfish, and they had a free source of fish to eat, and millions and millions and millions of tadpoles all over the place. And anyway, I was there with Shock and with Boris, and Boris, man of action, has a camera on his back, and he takes the tripod in one of those big old beta cam things, and he's wading into the water. He pulls his pant, rolls his pant legs up and strides off into the water. And Shock, who's in those days particularly very cautious, said, "No, you shouldn't do that. Boris, there are all kinds of parasites and organisms in the water. It's dangerous." And Boris looks around and says, "Yeah, you could catch tadpolio." We got our footage. At the same time, actually, interestingly enough, because the Osiris is associated with fertility, and while we were filming, a woman came down with her daughter. You could tell it was mother and daughter, to the water's edge, and completely oblivious to us doing what we were doing. The daughter is scooping water up her galabea, and to the locals that was a way of ensuring fertility. So, in other words, it lives on. And sometimes in certain of the temples, in the Sphinx sometimes, now not, because they've got the wall of Zahi around, so the locals can't get in, but you'd find little balls of paper, covered, sewn up with string of somebody, a petition, a prayer, like a votive prayer, was in with the Sphinx, who was reputed to have black magical powers, actually, by the locals. Abu Hol, they call him in Arabic, which means the father of terror.
John, where does the water come from?
It's groundwater.
It's groundwater.
Yeah, and so the level of the Nile is the level of the groundwater determines how much water is in here. At one point they put in, because when there's lots of water, they put in pumps to pump it out. But of course, once the pumps went into disrepair, which took, I think, probably 2 or 3 weeks, they never repaired them again. So anyway, but that's where the water comes from. I mean, it's a great mystery. I don't know. I mean, I think that legendary, in other words, it has something to do with Osiris consciousness, from time immemorial, before there's dynastic Egypt. That's my guess, because they don't do things like this.
But how do we know that if it's pre-dynastic, it has anything to do with Osiris?
What else? Where else in Egypt?
We don't know, but things you can't be sure, but the Osireion, I mean, it goes back to pre-dynastic times anyway, and when you study the stuff, the cosmologies are there to begin with. I mean, you can, with Göbekli Tepe, you can really prove that. So there's every reason, to believe that it did go back. Let's go right there. Yeah, there are 2 of them.
It's funny because I was here earlier and I couldn't see him.
Where is it?
Now all of a sudden I can see him really well. It's too dark to get a shot.
I'd like 5 of them.
I was trying to get a shot.
Like almost painted on there.
Yep.
In there.
another room.
leads to there. Yes,
Yeah,
right.
and another room built by city first.
City first or Minetta, I thought, or
المرن
Minetta
بتاعها
directed.
inscribed only here.
Right, right.
But
right.
city inscribed this room under the people.
Right,
Then.
right.
But Osireion, as you know,
Yes, before. Yeah, you agree, right. I have a good friend.